Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги и гости.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Allow me to declare the sitting of the Dissertation Council discussing the dissertation by Alla Kirillovskaya, theoretical substantiation of economic policy priorities. I would like to open the session begun. My name is Aleksandrovna, Professor, Department of Economic History, St. Petersburg State University. I was appointed to perform the functions of the chairperson of this meeting. Other members on the panel include Dr. Lyakin, Dr. Plotnikov, Department of Economic Theory and the History of Economic Thought, St. Petersburg State University, Andrei Gromov, Professor, Department of the Theory and History of Economic Thought Concepts, and Andrei Belov, Professor, Fukui Prefectural University in Japan. First of all, number 127 on Department in Research and Science, St. Petersburg State University has been awarded the right to award academic degrees. According to the decree, the session of the Dissertation Council is regarded legitimate when attended by at least 2/3 of the Dissertation Council. Present with us here today are 4 members of the Dissertation Council. One of the members will be joining us online. The quorum is there. Allow me to describe the agenda for our today's meeting. The session may not take more than 2 hours. It will open by the key thesis of the dissertation, the key concepts of the dissertation, 15 minutes. The author of the dissertation will then meet questions from the audience. Followed by reviews by members of the Dissertation Council. Ten minutes per person. The author of the dissertation will then respond to the critical comments, with 15 minutes allowed for this discussion. If there are members of the audience who would like to provide comments on the content of the dissertation, they may register for such comments with 5 minutes allocated for our research presentation. This item on the agenda will be followed by the voting on awarding or non-awarding of the scientific degree to the author of the dissertation, followed by the resolution of the Dissertation Council and a concluding statement by the author of the dissertation. Please switch off your mobile phones. I would also like to inform you that the session is being recorded. Simultaneous translation from Russian into English and from English into Russian will be provided throughout the session. I would like to announce the first point in our agenda. I would like to provide a brief statement about the dissertation in question. The dissertation on the subject theoretical substantiation of economic policy priority was submitted to the Dissertation Council on the 12th of January this year. The Dissertation Council was approved by the Decree of the Rector on the 10th of January 2010. The author of the dissertation has submitted all the required documents necessary for the defense, including a statement addressed to the St. Petersburg State University Rector, review by the academic supervisor, list of the publication containing 16 works, including 3 articles in peer-reviewed journals, a certificate of the 8th of April 2016 on the PhD examination being successfully passed by the author of the dissertation. A copy of the master's diploma and the dissertation in Russian and English. All the documents are fully consistent with Clause 12, Section 3 of the Decree on the Award of Scientific Degrees, Academic Degrees by St. Petersburg State University. Ms. Kirillovskaya, you now have the floor. You have 15 minutes. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, I would like to present my dissertation, Theoretical Substantiation of Economic Policy Priorities. My presentation will be composed of 4 parts. I will outline the relevance and academic importance and salience of the dissertation. First, the global economic crisis has pushed issues of economic policy to the foreground of economic research. The federal law on industrial policy has recently been signed. There are arguments about the priorities in economic policy and the key fields and areas of import replacement. However, it is still debatable as to what economic policy is. There is little agreement as to the structure and methods of economic policy. The objective of my dissertation can be outlined as follows: to develop the competence-based approach to economic policy given its modern priorities. There are 5 key principles that the work follows. Number 1, the work has identified 3 key principles of economic policy on the basis of Russian and German economic schools. The next slide presents classification of economic policy schools used in the work, including classical schools and modern schools. We have identified that research into economic policy as an independent discipline started with works by Julius von Soden, 1905, who can be regarded as the founder of the theory of economic policy. The existence of the German School of Economic Policy is beyond doubt. However, the initial and the Russian schools were first substantiated and outlined in this work. Some of the key representatives of these schools include Goldstein, Manuelov, and Mikloshevsky. The schools focused on the relations between political economy and economic policy. The German school did not acknowledge this division, as proponents of the German school gravitated towards more practical issues. The Russian school saw economic policy as different from political economy. Modern schools of economic policy gravitate towards institutionalized approach and fail to discriminate between economic policy and political economy. The St. Petersburg School continues the ideas founded by the classical school of economic thought. Economic policy is seen as a discipline with its own methodology, object, and subject matter. The dissertation identifies problems and priorities of modern economic policy. The slide presents key economic problems of economic policy identified on the basis of theoretical analysis. They include the problem of existence of economic policy, the ideological policy, the problem of theoretical basis, the problem of inventory and terminology. In order to solve the problems formulated, the author suggests an algorithm for the implementation of economic policy. In order to pursue economic policy, one must first select the theoretical concept for it, for this purpose. That makes it necessary to understand the conceptual framework that will be used. The methodology will be based on the subject and object of economic policy. Economic theory, in this case, must be seen as a system of limitations in the process of implementing economic policy from theory to practice. Let us focus on this algorithm in more detail. After we have identified the key goal of economic policy, let us select the theoretical concept, which may be either the liberal model or a model involving a more proactive role of the state. Economic policy will be understood broadly as an independent scientific discipline of a complex nature. In terms of typology of economic policy, we're going to adhere to the institutional approach developed by the author, combining three previously pre-existent approaches: industrial, strategic, and functional. Let us now focus on the priorities that will form the core of economic policy. They can be divided into immanent and variable. The suggested algorithm is oriented and driven by constant priorities, whereas economic policy is driven more by variable factors. The priorities were identified using the hierarchy pattern, AHP. There were several key priorities. State regulation of industry as a constant priority, and import replacement as a variable priority. The dissertation also formulates and substantiates the inconsistency of the existing approaches to economic restrictions. The work preaches a new approach to industrial policy. A proactive industrial policy is suggested, which will replace the traditional horizontal economic policies. Proactive industrial policy must create new basic rules of the game, prioritizing the capacities of national business and focusing on high technology industries. This policy must target social results, socially relevant results. Other priorities include import replacement and export. The key agents include the state sector, as well as internal private investments. The object involves transition to national and regional policies. These criteria were first outlined in this dissertation and characterize a new approach to industrial policy. The dissertation suggests a competitiveness matrix to evaluate the priorities in economic policies. The matrix will make it possible to evaluate the efficiency of economic policies in the given areas. The matrix is based on Lafay index on the x-axis and Balassa index on the y-axis. The matrix can be used to identify the winning and losing sectors of economy. The matrix is illustrated on the examples of Greece and Slovakia in the context of the recent economic crisis of 2008. The slide represents the Lafay and Balassa indices between 2006 and 2010 for Greece and Slovakia, with the winning industries being pointed out. Slovakia was most strongly impacted by the crisis, with only 2 of the industries left intact by the meltdown. In Greece, however, the most competitive industries include low technology industries relating to processing. That means that Greece must conduct economic regulation, whereas Slovakia needs to take a more proactive approach, stimulating innovation with the hard-hit sectors of the local industry. The dissertation also substantiates the possibility to use proactive regulation of industry in implementing the import replacement strategy. We have suggested a hypothesis that without active economic policy, import replacement is strictly dependent on currency exchange rates. Proactive policy helps to reduce the impact of currency exchange rates on the state of industry. We have calculated indices for self-sufficiency, including industrial self-sufficiency. We have constructed an econometric model studying the impact of currency exchange on the indicators being researched.
So these coefficients covered a large group of products. However, today I can represent only part of those. On the slide you can appreciate the group of products that feature a typical trend towards self-sufficiency and the products that were engaged into import replacement policies. The calculations show that the key factor is the value of ruble, and in correlation, so this coefficient is 0.8. And we can see that the data is concordant with the hypothesis under consideration. this import replacement policy, though efficient, is exposed to external factors. Therefore, an efficient import replacement policy can be calculated by the following algorithm. Import substitution was identified as a variable, whereas the basic constraints were the St. Petersburg School of Economics. According to the hierarchy, a research was performed to investigate into proactive governmental policy regulation to implement this policy in Russia. Economic safety and security are the key limitations introduced by von Soden. The matrix of the competitive potential of a specific area can be used as well. Economic policy and its efficiency were the ultimate goals. The key recommendations and conclusions. Initially, economic policy issues were identified and delivered on. The methods can be resolved by the economic policy algorithm. The language problem, the terminology, is referred to the proactive economic policy. Proactive industrial policy is also a response to the inventory challenge. As a result, I would like to focus on some key recommendations on economic policy in Russia. To have a favorable economic policy, we need a relevant environment that would promote intensive development of Russian businesses and not intensive ones. Thank you very much for your attention. Questions to the defendant? Please focus on the aspects that were mentioned in the report. Alla, could you please show the slide with limitations according to von Soden? Let me rewind the slides. So this is the limitation system. You mentioned it briefly in your report, but could you please focus on those in more detail? These limitations date back to the end of the 19th century, but these limitations were ahead of its time. In those times, we had a theoretical concept that stipulated the industrial economy approaches. So by those limitations, you mean some theoretical limitations that constrain the proactive activities of the government. Yes, exactly. Well, this is what I would like to focus on. Here, you may appreciate the agricultural products primarily, where we have a huge import replacement coefficient. As for some industrial products, which products did you take into account? Well, regrettably, I'm limited in time. Otherwise, I would share some other results as well. As for industrial products, we see a different landscape. In that case, the correlation between coefficients is reverse. It is negative. Well, as for hard and soft wood and fertilizers, this is exactly the picture for those products. well, if I'm not mistaken, constraints on hard and soft wood were introduced the year before the last year only, so you took into account state-of-the-art statistics. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. This is my question. Well, priorities in economic policies is a good thing. However, the challenge is that industrial policies are implemented on different levels. Did you consider the fact that there is a lot of controversy between various types of economic policy and various agents? Well, let's look at the economic policy of the Ministry of Finance, which usually targets the stability of the ruble. On the other hand, we see social policies, and may I refer to what Olga Golidet says. In that landscape, can we identify some integral priorities that would fit all the aspects of economic policy across Russia? Thank you so much for the question. Well, the concept which lays the ground for my research includes the institutional approach that features industrial, instrumental, and strategic approaches. These three aspects allow to analyze various aspects of economic policy from the point of view of various agents and institutions. This is the so-called integral, uniform approach to economic policy and its typology. As for the contradictions between the objectives of the social and the industrial policy, in that case, proactive economic policy embraces the social dimension, including new jobs, green economy, and environmental protection. This means that proactive industrial policy includes all of these aspects, possibly. Alla, could you please refer to the slide where you show the historical background of economic policy? Exactly. In the last part of this slide, you look at different schools. For example, the St. Petersburg school, from the past till the present. Well, if we look at the global trends from 1950s to 1990s, a lot has changed. In 1990s, when the new era of globalization started, economy and policies got married because all the decisions that were undertaken by politicians were somehow conditioned by economic profitability. As for the years before that, were aspects of profitability ignored, or they are just outside the scope of your analysis? Thank you so much. As for political considerations, this aspect is referred to in one of the paragraphs of my research about economic safety and security. What I mean is that economic sanctions actually follow some political objectives. In that case, better understanding of these processes and better understanding of economic security, can we optimize economic policy? Well, this is still a perspective for the future for me. Well, but beyond the framework of your dissertation, can you name some schools or some academics who have that view on economic policy? Well, I can refer to Neirodek, as well as Jan Sinberger. Those are not presented here. I can mention some Russian academics. Well, Peshechonov, Balkin, Eldashev. I refer to their research papers, and they represent a contemporary school. Thank you so much. I see no more questions. Well, you mentioned Neirodek, and I want to interfere as well. Neirodek has a paper that interprets the protectionist currency exchange rate as a specific limitation. Well, indeed, this weakens national currency. But after the $13 per citizen limit, we start to approach this particular coefficient. The way you analyzed import replacement and the way it is dependent to the national currency exchange rate. What are the advantages here for economic policy? And can these advantages be exhausted at some time? Thank you very much for the question. My impression is that the exchange rate, as well as inflation in economics, indeed, are exhaustible. Well, if things continue like that, then economy will get adjusted to external impacts. So with import replacement measures coming to the foreground. Okay, thank you. And Ray, do you have questions? Well, if I may, I would like to address a technical question, which, though, has a very broad scope. You compared Greece and Slovakia, the two countries. Why exactly these two countries? Is it your original analysis and ultimately the assistance provided to Greece by EU countries? Did you consider them in your analysis? Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, yes, this is my original example. Well, I decided to refer to these countries because to compare their pre- and post-crisis landscape, their status. So why exactly Greece? In 2012, I was at a conference in the Athens where I presented this particular matrix. Therefore, it was just exciting for me to present an analysis of the Greece economy in Greece. These results generated a lot of passionate response, lots of questions. So with long discussions to follow on the margins, and these discussions embraced representatives of other countries, not only Greece. Well, I mean, this is a nonsense of a reason, but to be more academic, I would like to say that industry in Greece is less analyzed overall in academic tradition. Okay, thank you. Let's now refer to specific to the reviews. We have 5 reviews provided by all the 5 members of the Dissertation Council, and all the reviews were submitted according to Provision 19 of the Decree of St. Petersburg State University. May I take advantage of my status of the chair and be the first to announce my review. So all the reviews are available on the website of St. Petersburg State University, so I will be brief. Overall, my assessment is positive. The dissertation is highly relevant and successful, and I consider it a solid piece of research. In anticipation, I'd like to say that the defendant deserves to be awarded the aspired degree. However, there are some aspects for criticism. First, the research is largely focused on such categories as economic policy, industrial policy. However, the defendant overlooks such category as policy as a term in its own right, which is a failure to my mind. Because if we use such terminology as economic policy or industrial policy and do not cover the notion policy, this is a failure. To my mind, a policy is manipulation. Manipulation using some inventory. For example, monetary policy of the central bank is to manipulate the interest rates and the currency exchange rate. My second recommendation is a follow-up to the first one. It is still unclear as to how economic theory shapes the economic policy. It is deemed that economic theory should not identify specific tools to be used in economic policy, but it should identify tools to be used to implement a specific economic policy. My third recommendation is that you refer to the legal aspects of the police. Regrettably, I did not find any references, any solid references to this term. So what do you mean by this? In Table 4, you refer to the data dated 2004, so it would be favorable to refer to some fresher data. So my next recommendation is that you refer to the Russian Economic School and the St. Petersburg Economic School. Well, that's indeed a justified approach. But normally, a school means that there are some followers and some integral idea that unites all of the members of this school. So what are the specific features of the St. Petersburg Economic School as contrary to the Russian Economic School? My next recommendation is that you should develop a clearer understanding of how economic policy is related to other economic phenomena. And this is what we saw from your speech. Well, let's refer to Sergei Witte and his failing economic reforms. In that case, you should note that by early 20th century, Russian industry was vastly controlled by international owners. So these reforms were costly and resulted in the fact that Russian industries were owned by foreign entities. Overall, I believe that this is a solid piece of research and you deserve to be awarded the aspired academic degree. The dissertation is drafted in accordance with the decree on academic degree awarding procedure, whereas Alla Kirillovskaya deserves to be awarded the aspired academic degree in economic theory.
Dear colleagues, my review is displayed on the university portal, so I will try to be very brief in my review of the work, which is indeed highly relevant academically, especially at this moment when economic imbalances have slowed down the development of Russian economy, the development of new innovation industry is slowing down. The subject of this dissertation is highly relevant in these settings. It translates in highly important considerations such as monetary policy, financial policy. In my opinion, the originality of the work in front of us depends on the simultaneous research of processes relating to formulation and implementation of the economic policy by the state on the one hand, and on the other hand, economic policy is a department, is a division of economic theory which enables us to articulate and describe the consequences of the measures adopted by the state in the economic sphere. Some of the key advantages of the dissertation is the description of the existing economic schools, the differences and similarities between them. Another valuable discovery is the matrix suggested by the author to evaluate priorities in the state policy. The use of this matrix has enabled the author to conclude the low efficiency of the top-down economic policy, as well as inefficiency of the horizontal policy relating to creating the favorable economic context. This enables the author to conclude that proactive economic policy is required as it enables to implement, to pursue economic policy in a highly relevant manner, The limitations outlined by the work are very few. The author identifies a number of formal contradictions between the governmental programs formulated by the author and their practical implementation. Some critical comments that I would like to make relate to the competitiveness matrix with Greece and Slovakia used as an example. The interval during which on which the research focuses is really very small. It turns out that Greece has a better, more mobile economy and was less hit by the crisis. However, if you take the data for 2016, the picture is highly consistent with the matrix. The industrially developed Slovakia is approaching the highly developed countries, whereas Greece, there are some troubles with Hungary as well, but Greece is gradually falling behind the Russian Federation. So industrial policy, on which the second chapter of the work focuses, is a highly sensible thing to do. So industry is the core of any national economy, and this is beyond doubt. Second is the use of the ruble as a protectionist barrier. The author only considers one dimension of the problem. However, there are many more. This protectionist barrier precludes renovation of the chief assets of the industry, and there are many interesting research works available on the subject, which unfortunately the author fails to quote. The works include publications by Trunin and Ponomarova. And as the previous speaker mentioned, the use of the definition by the author does not call for such a detailed analysis of the definitions used by the author's predecessors. On the whole, I would like to point out that despite certain drawbacks, the dissertation is lucid, it's consistent with the goals and objectives of the dissertation. The articles clearly present the author's viewpoints on the subject, and the dissertation is consistent with the key provisions of the degree on the awarding of academic degrees in Petersburg State University. Dear colleagues, I have also prepared the review for presenting on the university website. The work is indeed really mature, it's highly relevant. Industrial policy is both a theoretical and practical construct now in Russia. Last year, about 1 trillion ruble was spent on Russia to bail out the industrial enterprises undergoing bankruptcy. Last year, Russian economy started slowing down, and that means that the subject of the dissertation is highly relevant. And I really appreciate the author's attempt to considers the evolution of concepts regarding economic policy, and to identify the core features, some stable, some constant features that do not change over history depending on the economic conjuncture. The dissertation does produce a favorable impression. The author displays really good competence working with literature and analyzing literature. The literary sources are representative. The data that the author uses are very convincing. So the outcomes, the findings of the dissertation are entirely credible. Some elements of the research can be used in economic practice in this country. The same applies to the relevance and originality of the findings. Suggestions to introduce, to identify new scientific schools are really very valuable. Also appreciated the use the author makes of the analytic hierarchy process, as well as comparative by-country analysis, which is highly interesting, as my colleagues have already mentioned here today. This methodology enables to identify the priorities in economic policy, so the work is consistent with all the formal requirements, all the formal demands to research works, to dissertations. Of course, there are no such things as ideal research works. My review also contains a number of critical remarks that need to be addressed. The first of them being the evaluation of the contribution made by a Russian researcher to the theory of economic policy. The author provides an in-depth analysis of the German school of economic policy. However, she fails to address the legacy of Professor Baranovsky, whose ideas are really in great demand today. My second comment concerns a fragment relating to different factors in the effect of economic policy in terms of import replacement. Of course, more representative analysis is needed. This is technically very complex. There is a trend since 2016 in import replacement and import substitution. And these trends are not as representative as we would like them to be. We entered 2018 with in a situation when import dependence of Russia was described as very high. And it is very interesting whether this dependency is due to the market conjuncture or to any other factors. Finally, in terms of economic security, as the author mentions, it is not so much important to have import replacement as an instrument. It's important to consider import dependence, the dependence of the population or industry on import supplies. So this theoretical connection between import substitution and import dependence should be given more attention, should have been given more attention by the defendant. To sum up, I would like to say that on the whole, the dissertation is consistent with the requirements outlined and applicable to research works of this level. The key concept of this dissertation have been presented at a number of very reliable international conferences. The dissertation is consistent with all requirements established by the St. Petersburg State University Rector's decree on awarding academic degrees by St. Petersburg State University. So the author of the dissertation merits the academic degree sought. Dear colleagues, in my review, I focus on the relevance of the subject, on how substantiated the key concepts of the dissertation are. I focus on the reliability of the findings, on their significance to economic research. The review is published on the web portal of St. Petersburg State University. So I will try to summarize the key points of my review. The problem being described in the dissertation is highly relevant, but one question that I would like to ask is, why did you decide to take such a broad angle on the question? If the topic of the dissertation is described as priority of economic policy, the dissertation itself focuses more on industrial policy. So why did you decide not to focus on financial policy or monetary policy or investment policy? Or cryptocurrency, for example, and to what extent it impacts economic policy? These questions could have been avoided if the goals and objectives of the dissertation focused on industrial policy only. So this would have made it possible to avoid many of the unnecessary questions that form an important part of my my critical comments here today. A further question that arises is the agricultural components, the components relating to agricultural produce processing and transportation. Again, something that should have been, that could have been avoided had the scope of the research been formulated a bit more carefully. This would have resulted in a more balanced work, a more balanced approach to the scope of the research. Other than that, the dissertation is highly valuable in terms of both theoretical and practical results achieved. Indeed, I will agree that the author has produced many publications 16 in number, three of them in the publications on the list of recommended journals. Several questions that I would like to ask. The goal of the research, in my opinion, is a bit more narrow compared to the one that would have been required by the title of the dissertation. One of the objectives is formulated as identifying differences between scientific schools. Also, the formulation of scientific relevance does not enable to elucidate the author's contribution to economic theory. The author has also identified eight objectives of the dissertation. However, there are five elements, five principles that the author submitted for defense. Now, this is an inconsistency. Only one. It would have been more sensible to formulate just one objective to avoid this controversy.
So, in none of the provisions that cover the novelty of the dissertation do you cover these aspects. What's more, it is yet unclear what is actually your contribution. What's more, the matrix to assess the priorities refers to objective number 5, not objective number 3. As for the third and the seventh objective, none of them are resolved, because all of them are vague and unclear. The fourth disadvantage is that in the introduction, the defendant underscores the relation between the trade policy and the duty policy. However, according to the recommendations, there is no logical relation between those recommendations and your conclusions overall. The fifth conclusion covers the import replacement aspects. A distorted algorithm, however, on page 44 is presented, and it is also presented on the slide in this disrupted way. An algorithm has to be clear-cut, and it has to show a specific path to hit a result. On page 75, you have no titles of the charts. In the first chart and in the second chart, state or governmental support of industrial policies presented. In the conclusion, you present most significant results of your research. The original research, this is what you underscore. However, the results overall do not reflect this originality. I see no originality in paragraph 2, because those refer to the words of Russian Federation President on economic policy. The assessment of governmental regulation of industrial policy echoes those by Greenberg and Vandra. Despite these disadvantages, I think that the dissertation overall is valuable, and it is in conformity with the requirements for the aspired academic degree in the aspired specialty, according to the decree issued by St. Petersburg University rector. Therefore, my conclusion is that Alla Kirillovskaya deserves to be awarded the Aspired Academic Degree. Thank you. Professor Belov.
Мне очень приятно принимать участие.
Distinguished colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to be today with you, and it was a pleasure to read the dissertation. Now may I focus on the key aspects of my review. As for the relevance, well, it is highly relevant, both for Russian economics and economics of Japan. What we see in Japan is a vibrant discussions on economic theory and possible outcomes of monetary challenges and fiscal challenges, and all this manifests the relevance of the dissertation for global economic science. As for relevance, so I join in to everything what is said about it in the dissertation. Next come the structure. The structure is valid and it echoes the high academic caliber of the author. The dissertation is translated into English. For 20 years I have been lecturing in a small Japan university. Over these 2 decades I have frequently participated as a member in a dissertation review boards, and only one dissertation over these 20 years was prepared in English as well. So this is something which is a breakthrough. The measures that have been implemented in St. Petersburg State University allow for international transparency and international assessment. So to me, the English translation of the dissertation is of ultimate value. I attach ultimate value to this measure, to this requirement. I mean, to have the dissertation translated into English. Another advantage of the dissertation is the analysis of existing resources. What I favor is the comparison between Russian economic school and German economic school, which brings together comparison across universities, across luminaries. Some of them I know in person, but I had no chance to develop an insight into their research papers. Well, this is true about some of them. Well, the same stands true for the second chapter, which looks at the relation between economic policy and governmental regulation. The third chapter is devoted to import replacement and economic security. This chapter also analyzes historical aspects and existing trends, providing also some calculations and estimations to prove the conclusions. Those are the positive aspects of the dissertation. As any piece of research, it also has some disadvantages, some drawbacks. Well, I have some recommendations to the defendant. Those are as follows. The review of existing resources lacks a specific traits of economic policy that are manifested by capitalism. What I mean is the varieties of capitalism approach. This approach is mutually adopted. And this approach traditionally identifies liberal market economy and coordinated market economy. To me, if we classify the existing research papers from that viewpoint, everything would have been much more simple, allowing to have a better understanding of mainstream economic policy. As for industrial policy, this is the second chapter, by the way. This particular piece and the analysis of this phenomenon should be done within the framework of the economic governmental theory, identifying such functions of the government as redistribution of the well-being, regulation, so on and so forth. When analyzing industrial policies, we should refer to this particular widely spread terminology and mutually adopted approaches. This would provide a new impetus to our efforts. Next, the third chapter is an attempt to calculate the priorities of economic policy. This chapter indeed features some econometric calculations. However, the indices cover a very narrow scope. What's more, it is unclear why exactly these indices were selected. What are the principles behind those indices? Despite the given disadvantages, the dissertation cannot be invalidated. Therefore, my conclusion is that the dissertation submitted by Alla Kirillovskaya, Theoretical Substantiation of Economic Policy Priorities, is in conformity with the key requirements, whereas the defendant, Alla Kirillovskaya, deserves to be awarded the inspired academic degree of Doctor of Economics. Madam Kirillovskaya, the floor is yours. You can now respond to the recommendations. Please mind the time limit. I would like first and foremost extend my gratitude to members of the Dissertation Council for their efforts, for the revision, for their attention to my dissertation, and I would like to provide some responses that I hope might be of some value. I accept most of the recommendations, but some of them I would like to focus on in my responses. As for the recommendation to have a better focus on what economic policy is as a term, well, I should say that on page 52 I refer to several definitions of this term. On page 51, it is written that within the St. Petersburg Economic School there is a functional and instrumental approach to define this term. The defendant suggests the instrumental approach regarding the economic policy from the point of view of institutions. This approach is implemented in my dissertation. The second recommendation refers to the influence of the theory on economic policy. The author's viewpoint is that economic policy as an independent direction should have its subject and object, therefore theoretical approach should be tailored to these, to the object and subject of the economic policy. Next, recommendation on the imperial lectures about the law for policemen. Well, if I refer to the Kornfeld research dated 1929, these lectures that were lectured by Bunge and Antonovich referred to the administrative law, or just one of the aspects of administrative law. Then, Ehrenfeld here means a comparison of specific historical aspects of governmental economic policy. This does not allow me to attribute these lectures as relevant for administrative law. Next, on pages 91 and 93, I refer to failing economic policy of Slovakia. And this is, by the way, what you can see on the slide. This particular situation was analyzed, therefore, a specific time frame was necessary to demonstrate the efficiency of economic policy within this specific time frame. Without a specific time frame, this analysis would have not been valid. Next, as for the St. Petersburg School of Economic Policy, I should say that over 20 years, this school has issued 20 books, 9 proceedings, 18 MA dissertations, 3 doctorate dissertations. And this school is represented by Professor Lyakin, Professor Lopatov, Professor Flashkus, Professor Autunyan. This school hosts relevant conferences and devoted roundtables. Therefore, I should say that this is an independent economic school, not a school within the Russian economic school. In 1895-1898, the monetary reform performed by Witte, this is my next reply to the next recommendation, failed. Therefore, this situation is rather a predicament. As for the review by Professor Lyakin, the first recommendation on the competitive environment matrix, here I refer to the Greece reforms dated 2012. Next, assessment of import replacement efforts. The key objective of my research is not to cover all import replacement efforts, but to focus on those efforts that were strategic, that were proactive. Therefore, I do not cover all of the efforts undertaken in this respect. As for other recommendations, such as my abuse of various coefficients and indices, yes, indeed, this is true. However, this is an only way to make a systematic overview of economic policies, and therefore I refer to different indices and different definitions of economic policy. So this was identified as a specific terminology challenge.
Приведение определений действительно.
On pages 63 and 67, yes, indeed, I stipulate the notion of industrial policy.
Перейдем к замечаниям Владимира Александровича Плотникова.
The dissertation also focuses on the classical schools of economic policy. Some of my esteemed colleagues have mentioned that I have not given enough attention to Professor Baranovsky's contribution to Russian economic school. However, it is his works that the Western world was introduced to Russian economic school principles through. However, Professor Baranovsky more single-mindedly focused on social policy rather than economic policy. It has been remarked that input replacement in the work focused on certain categories of products. However, the work sees input replacement as part of proactive approach rather than attempts to give its detailed analysis. Input replacement and input dependence are not disclosed in the dissertation because they fall outside the scope of this research. However, the question is highly interesting in terms of its potential as a research subject. It has been noted that the research is more narrow compared to the goals outlined at the beginning of the dissertation in the introductory part of the dissertation. Now, this is something that I cannot agree with. The scientific, our understanding of scientific relevance is indeed was indeed slightly unfortunate. However, the contribution on the part of the author to economic theory is clearly visible in the passage focusing on the scientific relevance of the dissertation. The objective 3 of the dissertation forms part of the second component of scientific relevance regarding the identification of economic policy priorities. As for the next critical comment about objectives 4, 6, and 7. So objective 4 is consistent with point 5 of the scientific relevance. The sixth comment is that the defendant emphasizes the connection between the research with trade and customs policy. However, I never identified this connection anywhere in my work. Moreover, trade and customs policy is first mentioned on page 53 of the dissertation in connection with Wallstein's opinions on economic policy. It was his contribution to work, not, I'm afraid, not mine. The work attempted to develop a comprehensive approach to economic policy. This direction is considered to be, we consider it to be a priority in our first research. The incorrect construction of algorithms is something that I cannot agree with, because algorithms presented in the work are built as flowcharts. The algorithms in my work are consistent with the definitions of what an algorithm has to be about. In the conclusion, the author presents the most significant findings of the dissertation. I have read the existing national standard issued in 2011 about the structure and rules of the dissertation summaries. And the standard calls for the conclusion outlining the key directions for further research. My conclusion is absolutely consistent with this definition. Finally, questions about the available research publications. Of course, it would be interesting to pursue research in this area. However, I did not set this objective at the beginning of this study. Questions about the role of the state are considered in the dissertation in connection with the classical schools. However, I practice a more general approach. Finally, about the narrow circle of indices used in the formulation of economic policy priorities. As we focused on import replacement as a strategic priority, we identified a small number of indices to reflect this objective. Thank you for your attention. Is there anybody that would like to contribute to the discussion? No. Thank you. In this case, I would like to give the floor to the research supervisor. Vadim, you have the floor. Good afternoon. It is my mission as a research supervisor to characterize the dissertation. The dissertation written by Alla Kirillovskaya contains an in-depth analysis of the issues in question. It contains a detailed treatment of economic policy and its priorities. It is necessary to note that the defendant systematized the available publications, including some rare sources like works by von Soden, by Filipovich, by founders of the Russian schools of economic policy, and its critics like Miglashevsky with its fantastic works. Classification of approaches to modern industrial and economic policy substantiated the necessity of a new proactive policy which will enable us to resolve many issues that Russian economic policy is beset by at the moment. Some useful recommendations have been made regarding economic policy. The relevance of Alla's work is obvious because of the dramatic, because of Russia dramatically lagging behind many other regions of the world in a number of areas, including space technologies. Alla has demonstrated that she is a capable researcher who can resolve highly complex scientific issues. The findings of the dissertation have been presented at a number of international conferences, including the events in Greece and Slovakia, and as well as Bilbao, where many listeners on the audience were amazed by the whole concept of industrial policy. The author created a number of research publications, one of which is indexed, is a Scopus publication. The other is indexed in WOS. The quality of the dissertation is really high. Alla is a research worker that absolutely deserves the academic degree being sought here. Now I would like to announce a general discussion. Does any member of the Dissertation Council wish to make a statement on the dissertation? Allow me to take the floor. I would like to allow myself a brief comment. This defense has convinced me that the researcher is a mature research worker. However, there is something that I would like to point out laudably, namely the confidence of the author in this discussion. That means that the author has a really deep understanding of the idea, of the key concepts, has her own view of the situation, which rests on much more than conviction. It rests on scientific publications, on being familiar with the viewpoints and opinions of both Russian and international researchers. That means that the author is a really excellent specialist. In my opinion, the work and the defendant meet all the necessary requirements, and I'm ready to endorse the request for the academic degree. Dear colleagues, we have all been there, we have defended our research projects and publications, and we understand that a dissertation also determines a lot of the defendant's research future. And it is highly valuable that the researcher points out the exact research areas and fields that she is planning to pursue in the future. It shows that that our defendant is able to act on the critical comments and develop Russian economic theory in the desired in the desired fields and the desired directions. So the defense shows that Alla does merit the academic degree sought.
Professor Belov, would you like to make a statement as well? Well, actually, it is a pleasure for me to be able to participate in the operation of this dissertation council in person, by the way, and the very fact that the dissertation is translated into English makes it even more fundamental. So this deserves a lot of merit. So I would like that the students and the postgraduates of Japanese universities also sooner or later come up with a translation into English of the text of the dissertation. I'm so happy that St. Petersburg State University has already delivered on this task. I'm so happy, it's fascinating. I would like to join all the valuable comments that have been pronounced today. Alla has presented a very well justified piece of research. It's a solid piece of research. And therefore, I believe that we have all the right to support her in her endeavors and to have a positive assessment of her achievements and award her with this inspired academic degree. Thank you. Indeed, I believe that the topic of the dissertation is enormously relevant in economic literature. This topic is largely overlooked, especially in the context of economic theory. Normally, everyone speaks about some inventories of economic policy, but not the economic policy in its own right. This dissertation brings together both traditional methods as well as cutting-edge econometric approaches, also embracing the existing methods typical for St. Petersburg Economic School. So I was really impressed by this dissertation. I believe that the defendant deserves to be awarded the inspired academic degree of Doctor of Economics. Now I have to announce the break, a 5-minute break, please, to allow for some discussions. Please switch off the broadcasting and leave the room. Thank you.
Заседание продолжается. Прошу включить звуковой соображение.
The broadcasting is on. We resume the meeting. So is the broadcasting on? Yes, it is. Okay. May I put to a vote the issue on awarding the defendant with the expired academic degree? The decision is valid if all the members of the dissertation meeting voted on this issue, but no less than 2/3 of its members. Professor Lyakin, yes, I vote in favor. Professor Plotnikov, I vote in favor. Professor Harlamov, I vote in favor. And Professor Belov, I'm in favor. Me, Alexander Dubyansky, vote in favor. May I declare, distinguished colleagues, that out of all the 5 members of the dissertation board, 5 members of the board have voted in favor of the awarding the aspired academic degree to Alla Kirillovskaya on her dissertation, Theoretical Substantiation of Economic Policy Priorities, in the specialty 080001 Economic Theory. No abstentions, no negative votes. May I thus declare that the decision is adopted. Madam Kirillovskaya, your final address. Distinguished members of the Dissertation Council, I would like to extend enormous gratitude for your contribution, for the time invested into my dissertation, and for your final decision adopted. All the recommendations are of ultimate value to me. Indeed, in the future, I'm looking forward to go on with my academic career. I would like also to say thank you to those who made a lot for my defense. First and foremost, those are my first research supervisor, Professor Rybin. Well, I wish he were together with us today, but regrettably, this is impossible. I'm also highly thankful to Professor Lyakin, Professor Alpatov, and Mr. Grachov, who also interfered into my research on its every stage and provided me with lots of valuable comments. I'm also thankful to Mr. Blagich, who assisted me a lot with some clues on the theoretical justification of the priorities and overall support. And I'm also enormously thankful to Vadim Pashkus and Natalia Pashkus. Without them, my defense would not have been here. Thank you so much. The meeting of the Dissertation Council is adjourned. Thank you for participation. Please switch off the broadcast.